Good morning, sports fans. This is Mr. Sabs once again. I'm finishing up the very first chapter of macroeconomics for IBDP. This one, I love this section because it's on the business cycle. And as my students know, business is my main topic. So let's get right into it. It won't be a very long one. In developed countries, you can pretty much see a pattern of growth over time. As mentioned earlier, one of the major macroeconomic objectives of every country is to grow. We call this the business or trade cycle. So the business cycle is fluctuations that happen over time in economic activity. That's measured by the changes in real GDP, and that's how you can track these fluctuations, ups and downs. So you have phases that are named in the business cycle. Boom, recession, trough, and recovery are the four main phases. Fluctuations in practice are highly irregular, but let's take a look at this figure because this sort of pretty much shows a standard typical periodic cycle. So what you have is, this is on this side here, you've got the real GDP. So once again, inflation is accommodated for over time. So as time goes on, you want to see the GDP get higher and higher. And you can see that the trend is overall that way, but it's not a straight line. So you've got areas where there's actually a recession, and then recovery, and then it booms where it peaks out, and then a recession again, and then down to a trough, and so on and so forth. But slowly, every time, the troughs get a little bit higher, and then the booms get a bit higher, and that indicates growth in economies. So let's just talk a little bit more detail about the different phases. The recovery phase is when we see economic expansion. So there's a fast rising increase rate of real GDP. A lot of that is driven by an increase in what we are calling aggregate or total demand in the economy. And we're going to get into this. There's a whole chapter on this coming up. So an increase in aggregate, i.e. total demand in the economy, is what causes this rise. So this comes from demand by households for more output because they're making more and more money. So an increase in demand might lead to more workers being employed because companies need now more manpower to pump out all of this demand. The newly employed workers will then spend their incomes on new goods and services because now they have money in their pocket. And so it just keeps feeding more and more into the economy. You can see how it's a cycle. Just as the increase for demand of a good or service can then create an increase in demand, the price then goes up. And then increasing aggregate demand in the economy can then lead to an increase in overall average prices. So that's pretty much inflation starting to occur. So people have money, they're spending, there's a lot more demand, prices start slipping up, and then we reach this boom. And that's where there's a lot of inflationary pressure. So prices just start getting jacked up because everyone's employed, everyone has money in their pocket, disposable income. And it causes suppliers and business people to try and increase prices to make more profit. So the economic policymakers are going to try and react and slow down the growth because they don't want inflation. Remember, that goes against one of the macroeconomic objectives. So as a result of these practices, it's going to start creating a recession where you're going to see the downward part of the cycle. So this is actually almost done on purpose to try and decrease inflation. So recession is defined in economics terms as 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. So quarter, once again, 3 months out of the year. So it's pretty much 6 months in a row of negative GDP, where your GDP is actually decreasing. So the economy actually gets smaller. It's different than the one thing to point out. There's a difference between GDP falling and the rise getting smaller, because the rise getting smaller means that there's still growth, it's just less growth than normal, while falling, it's going downwards into a recession. So falling aggregate demand, total demand, leads firms to do what? So they hired all these people because demand was high. Now all of a sudden no one's buying anymore, so guess what? They lay them off, unemployment starts to rise, More people unemployed means that there's less spending, lower levels of demand, result in lower inflation or even deflation. Prices just get cheaper than they used to be. So it creates the opposite issue. Now, at some point, the contraction comes to an end, and that's where it comes to the trough. It doesn't continue to fall forever because there's always going to be someone employed and spending at least a minimum level of contribution or consumption. Also, don't forget that we do foreign trade. So things like exports will still be bringing in some sort of money. So GDP, there'll always be a sort of minimum level. It never completely crashes out. And that's where the trough is then. But it's a really low level of demand for money. As a result of this demand, guess what? Prices will start coming down. And then we start entering back into the recovery phase where the cycle repeats. Because when prices come down, more people can afford things. They start buying. Companies have to hire more workers. Yada, yada, yada. And the cycle goes on. So the diagram... when you have two different cycles coming, you can actually start developing like a long-term trend line. So this figure here, 13.4, kind of will show you the fluctuations over time. So you can see that, you've got the recession, trough, recovery, boom, recession, trough. So the line long-term is actually a straight line. And that's the general direction that the GDP is taking. Now, you're not always right at that line, but on average, it averages out long term to have that trend of growth. So this long-term trend shows an increase in output over time, and it kind of represents the growth rate that the economy can sustain over time. All right. The difference between the actual output and the potential output has a term. It's called an output gap. So any difference between what is actually happening in the economy and the potential, which you get from drawing the line, the long-term trend line, is called a gap. So at A, you can see that there's a gap because our actual output is less than our potential output. There's a positive gap in B where you can see here that our actual output is above the potential output. So we're working beyond capacity, and that's probably where inflation is going to start kicking in because you're working over capacity of the trend line. So the economy is producing the trend line above. So when you think about it, in the economy, there's always going to be a payoff. When you're at A, your actual output is less than what you need, which means that you probably don't have enough employment. There's not enough staff creating that output. So you probably have really high unemployment at A, while B, employment is great, but guess what? Inflation is increasing. So in the business cycle, it's always constantly this balance or trade-off between inflation and unemployment. When you're operating below the trend line, unemployment is the issue. When you're operating above the trend line, inflation is an issue. So obviously we're going to get into a lot more detail on this. But economists have studied the causes of business cycles for a really long time. There really are no real answers like many other things. It is a social science. There's not a lot of hard science behind some of this. The government is likely to stimulate an economy with different policies to either lower unemployment in certain instances, or if there's a boom, try and find different solutions to fix that. But what we do see a trend of is around election time is usually where you see the most growth. So it is a big criticism, but obviously a lot of the people managing the government probably want to look pretty good right before election time. And as a result, they start to really pump up the economy and boost things and try and get a lot of growth right before voters get out there and vote to give them a better chance of staying in power. Welcome to the corrupt capital market. So international economics, don't forget once again, we're not just talking usually about goods and services or business activity taking place inside the country. Income is a determinant of consumption. So consumers sometimes buy things that might be imported. So not all the money being spent is spent on things created within the nation. So Even if the final products consumed are produced domestically, sometimes they're made up of imported components. So if incomes rise, import spending might rise too. You might get that fancy foreign stuff when your income goes up, because you don't want to get like the plain boring whatever stuff locally. As inflationary pressure builds during an expansion period, the prices of the country's exported goods will also start to rise. So what happens is that when your prices of export goods rise, so when your economy is booming and your prices start going up, other countries are less likely now to purchase your exports because they look a lot less competitive. They're going to buy them from cheaper countries. Therefore, when there's economic expansion, you tend to see a rise in import and a lower revenue of exports. So it messes up your trade of balance of goods and services, which is once again another objective. Remember, we want balanced payments between imports and exports. But when you're booming, you have a lot more imports because you can afford them and your currency is strong, but less exports because other people are less interested, other countries are less interested in buying your stuff because you're getting really expensive. So it's really, and then the opposite happens, when in a contradictory phase, when your bottom import spending will fall because people have less money that they can afford those more expensive imported items. Export prices are going to get really cheap, so now they're more competitive. So actually you might increase your export revenue because you're much more competitive than other countries in the world. Either way, your balance of payments is not up to par. So the business cycle itself can kind of explain or impact 4 of the 5 different macroeconomic objectives. Obviously, economic growth can be explained by it. So, rises in GDP or falls in GDP in a bad economy. Unemployment can be explained. Obviously, while you're rising, you're going to need more and more workers. And then at the boom, you'll have the highest employment, less employment in a contraction, low and stable rates of inflation. So you're going to have high inflation pressure during expansion, low inflation during contraction, and finally, in either case, no balance of payments, because when the economy is good, you're going to have more spending on imports, less export selling, and in a contraction, you're going to have a lot more export revenue generated, but not so much imports. I think that's about it, guys. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and all that crap. Anyway, have a good day.